Morena no mai, haere mai, ki te Aotearoa Food Safety Science and Research Centre. Ko Vivian Hunt ho, ka nui te mihi nui kia koutou katoa. My name is Vivian Hunt, and on behalf of the New Zealand Food Safety Science and Research Centre, I'd like to welcome you all here today to our first Spotlight on Food Safety Science seminar for 2022. Today, the topic is Perspectives from the International Science Advisory Panel, and we have two of our members, Dr. Andrew Pearson and Dr. Arno Van Vlie, who is zooming in from the UK at 9 p.m, but he's got his coffee, so he's okay. And they're going to share their perceptions about the potential food safety challenges in the year ahead and how these might be addressed with new technologies or methodologies that can improve practice. Andrew's going to speak first about the risk of emerging and recently emerged chemical contaminants. As Andrew sets up, I'll quickly introduce him for those of you who don't know him. So Andrew, you're going to start sharing your screen. Andrew was appointed to the ISAP in 2020, and he's a senior environmental consultant at Tonkin & Taylor. His expertise is in environmental chemistry and chemical risk assessment. This includes technical work covering emerging contaminants. He's worked on chemical risk assessment for over 16 years and previously worked at MPI in a regulatory food safety role. He has chaired a working group for Codex on food contaminants in food to establish maximum levels for methyl mercury in fish species, and he's currently serving on a joint FAO-WHO expert committee on food additives that looks at the exposure assessment of chemicals in food. Andrew is involved in several collaborations with New Zealand universities, including PhD projects at the University of Canterbury. So before I hand over and get Andrew to start, I'll just remind you, you can send questions using chat, or you can raise them after Andrew's spoken. We're going to have hopefully some time after both Andrew and Arno have spoken to at the end. So over to you, Andrew, and thank you for presenting today.
Yeah, not a problem. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, thank you for tuning into this New Zealand Food Safety Science Research Centre webinar this morning. So yeah, really the topic I want to cover off is looking at, as we shift to a circular economy, how the challenges for contaminants will come through, and particularly for those in the food safety space. So yeah, really, I probably don't need to explain the circular economy. It's been a concept that's been around quite a few years now, but just in relation to New Zealand, I guess. Yeah, in 2018, in our last tally of how much waste was going to landfills, yeah, we were putting 3.7 million tonnes into our landfills in New Zealand, and that was the fourth most per capita in the OECD. I guess the difficulty with that is landfilling that waste isn't sustainable. It just buries it for a future generation to manage. And I think we've seen with some of the recent landfills being washed into rivers in the South Island, that it is an issue that will come through in the future for some of those sites. So I guess when we talk about a circular economy, waste's pretty critical for that. I mean, you want to avoid as much as possible putting that waste into the ground and seeing it go back into the economy and be reused. And we've seen that in New Zealand so far with some of the initiatives that have been put through, and that includes phasing out of single-use plastics, and also the putting in place of product stewardship schemes to actually follow those products throughout their life cycle and get the most out of them. And I guess the next step of this, so Ministry for the Environment put out a consultation towards the end of last year discussing a new waste strategy for New Zealand, and that was to improve that performance and also look at some of these legacy issues and how to manage them. And the key aspect of that was an aspiration of a circular economy for Aotearoa, New Zealand, by 2050. So there's a lot to do, but I think that aspiration is a fantastic one to have. So yeah, really just on the circular economy versus linear economy. So we're making this transition at the moment from basically taking from natural resources, using them up, and then disposing of them, and yeah, going to landfill mainly. What we're looking at moving to is where those cycle through the economy. So you're recycling, reusing, and avoiding the scenarios where you've got single-use material or material that can't be recycled back into the economy. So what I really want to focus on is how this might impact on the food safety system. And when you look at this waste hierarchy, what we want to move away from is at the bottom, that treat and dispose. So that's where things are going into landfill, to where we're at the top. So where you're reducing the waste that we're creating, and also redesigning how products are developed, so that waste is not there, or there are potentials for reusing or repurposing that. And I guess the kind of the key area for me is this middle step. So I think for the next few years at least, this is where a lot of the focus will be on, is moving into these recycling and reuse chains. And I think for the food system, you can see a number of these already reasonably advanced, and others looking at coming in the next couple of years. So I guess the one that's been well advanced for a number of years is reuse packaging, and I think the glass bottles. So that's been an example that's been in place for many years. You think of your milk coming in glass bottles and then going back and being washed and being put back into use. There are others. So there's been a lot of work on food wastes and the opportunities to either get that into repurposed, so either going into animal feed systems or also going into composts if it can't be, and then having a nutritious product to put back onto the land for crop nutrition. There's some of the redesigning, so looking at replacing plastics, synthetic plastics with bioplastics, looking at having compostable packaging, so end of life, it can go into that compost system and be reused. And also things like recycling various plastics and getting them back into reuse as recycled material. So really, I think the challenge here for the food system, I guess, and probably the broader waste system, will be chemical contaminants, and particularly those where the properties of those contaminants, such as the persistence or the ability to bioaccumulate, will result in a risk that these reuse and recycling initiatives will just circulate them through the circular economy. And I think one of the challenges will be what work needs to be undertaken to understand what these contaminants are doing, where their fate is in the circular economy, and what the dietary implications of this are for food safety. And I think what we've seen is when you have some changes on the scale that movement to the circular economy is going to produce, it's often been a driver for emerging contaminants to come through. So there is potential that we will see new contaminants of concern in the food chain as a consequence. So I just want to cover off a couple of the different aspects of the circular economy in relation to the food system, and just present a few examples of contaminants that might be an issue through this. And I guess flagging this is more of a hazard exercise than a real risk exercise. A lot of the data for these additives or contaminants isn't available at the moment. Just, I guess, it's prediction based on the properties and some of the studies available, what might be a concern going forward, particularly if some of these circular economy chains do scale up and become the normal. So plastic reuse and recycling, it's already well advanced, and we're looking, I guess, globally at ways to have the plastics that are in use be more available for reuse and recycling. And I think one of the issues here is there are thousands of different additives that are available to go into plastics, such as flame retardants, UV absorbers, plasticizers, and then these can persist through that reuse and recycling. So you end up with a recycled product with these non-intentionally added substances present that may be from that original use. It might also be from what was contained in that original packaging. So you might have a case where such as a fragrance will be maintained in that plastic and go through to the recycled plastic and potentially end up in the food as a result if it's stored in that recycled plastic. So yeah, as I said, there's a vast number of different substances used in plastics. A mapping exercise just last year identified 6,000 different substances in use. And a lot of these do match with priority substance lists. So yeah, a quarter of these were matched with various international regulator lists of contaminants or substances that might be a concern for persistence or toxicity. And some of the studies looking specifically at recycled plastics, one on HDPE and LDPE pellets, they found, so these were recycled pellets, they found 134 different substances. And a lot of these are data limited. So there's very poor understanding of what their properties might be for the resulting product, the resulting plastic and whatever's contained in it. And I guess that there are a number of papers that do flag that often these recycling initiatives happen without consideration of the risks that might occur from these non-intentionally added substances. And so the graph to the right of this slide just details some of the hazard classification that was undertaken from that mapping exercise of those 6,000 additives in plastic, and just putting them against various categories of toxicity. And you can see, I mean, that there are a lot of those that do flag up with various hazard properties. And this doesn't necessarily relate to risk in the resulting recycled plastic or whatever is contained in it, but it is a flag that there are potential substances of concern that might end up in the food chain as a result. So one that's getting a reasonable amount of attention at the moment is UV328. So this is a phenolic benzotriazole, and it's used in a broad range of products as a UV absorber. So it basically protects that plastic from UV radiation and makes sure it doesn't fragment or break down. So yeah, it's used in various surface coatings, a wide range of plastics. It's also used in inks, and I mean it's been used in personal care products such as sun creams as well. And some studies that have been undertaken the last couple of years, so in Australia, 40% of the production of this chemical went into plastics. And it can actually form a reasonable high level in those plastics, so up to about 1% of the mass. And the reason this UV328 is being flagged as a big concern is it has this low degradation potential. It does persist a very long time in the environment, and it's also very good at bioaccumulating. So it has a potential, it's very lipophilic and will bioaccumulate through human tissues, and it's also been seen in various environmental receptors as well, such as fish and seabirds. And I guess one of the issues for this chemical is that it's known to persist in plastic fragments in the environment. So it will survive through that recycling chain for plastics and end up in the recycled plastics. And that does present the potential that particularly long-term recycling might see this contaminant just as a source of migration into foods if these plastics get used in the food system. So there is a reasonable amount of work underway at this. So in last year, this contaminant was assessed by the Stockholm Committee as meeting the screening criteria to be listed as a persistent organic pollutant. And it's the first non-halogenated substance to be considered by the Stockholm Committee as meeting that criteria. So it's likely there will be a lot of action in years to come to remove this from the environment. But at present, I mean, it is in plastics and it's likely working its way through those recycling chains. So another area is this reuse of waste streams. So waste streams meaning things like wastewater, manures, and composts. So I mean, they contain valuable levels of organic matter and nutrients, and the benefits of using those and productive land for crops is quite considerable. I think as well, there's a lot of interest, not necessarily in New Zealand at the moment, but certainly there's been a lot in Europe around water reuse. So as demands on surface and groundwater resources increase, and particularly as we have a changing climate and potentially more droughts, the demand for reusing grey water or wastewater will increase. And I think one of the difficulties is these waste streams can concentrate chemicals, and we use a vast range of chemicals in society, from medicines, cleaning products and cosmetics, and often these waste streams won't treat them, and they will end up in the resulting water. I think a lot of the focus in this area has been on the environmental impacts of these contaminants, but there's also an interest on them entering the food chain. And I know MPI in 2018 did a risk profile on the aquatic food chain to look at whether some of these emerging contaminants would be a risk ending up in wild food species or agriculture. And I think one of the big difficulties for for the next few years is the lack of data. So there is, particularly when they're in an agricultural sense, the understanding of the potential for these emerging contaminants to uptake into food crops, and also whether they will long-term accumulate in the soils. So that's limiting a lot of the potential to undertake any risk assessment here. So one of the examples here is sulfamethoxazole. So this is an antibiotic, and it's usually used in combination with another antibiotic, trimethoprim, and it's used in New Zealand in both human and veterinary uses. And I guess what the difficulty with this substance is, once it's been consumed and done its job, it is excreted. It's excreted as the parent itself and also a acetylated metabolite. And from there, in wastewater, it's highly mobile and it's also persistent. And there's a lot of international reporting finding it in wastewaters, grey waters, and also in manures and biosolids. And when studies have looked at applying these wastewaters to crops through irrigation, it has been shown to translocate and actually into the edible parts of the crops. So it's been found in studies getting through into the tomatoes and also into wheat grain. Now, these aren't huge levels. These are quite low, really, and the exposure assessments resulting from these studies have usually said it's not a concern at those levels. But I guess the area that might prove a risk in the future is if irrigation with these grey waters does increase, and you might see cumulative exposure across the diet to this substance. And certainly it's not the only drug that's been seen to follow these chains as well. So carbamazepine, the anti-seizure drug, I believe, has also been seen to have similar rates of uptake into crops. And really, talking about contaminants in the circular economy wouldn't be complete without a few slides on PFAS. So these are the per and polyfluorinated alcohol substances. And it's a large chemical family. It seems to increase every day how many substances get assigned into this family. But as of the start of last month, it was 12,000 on the US EPA list. And these are widely used across society. So in things like firefighting foams, to your textiles and your surface agents. Yeah, huge uses of these across society. And I mean, the big concern is that fluorocarbon chain is highly persistent, and you see minimal breakdown of that in the environment. So these substances just last almost indefinitely in the environment. And in New Zealand, we've seen these emerge. So in 2017, they first emerged around the issue of contamination from the use of firefighting foams. And the regulatory focus was placed on 3 of them, so PFOS, PFOA, and PFHXS. And really, the concern with these is they do have this long residence time in humans. It takes several years for them to be excreted. And we're certainly seeing them in humans. So the Massey University study in 2013 that looked at adult blood serum found that PFOS and PFOA are in 100% of the tested adults. And as a result, globally, we're seeing these go onto the Stockholm Convention list. and they're now largely being phased out. So uses that have relied on this, it's called C8 chemistry because of the 8 carbons, have really been phased out globally. So one of the, I guess, the areas looking at this is because you have a vast range of these PFAS substances in use, they tend to degrade to the simpler forms over time in the environment. So here's just a, sorry, it's really complicated diagram of lots of structures, but really what it's just trying to show is you get this breakdown of the more complicated forms, so the fluorosurfactants, to more simpler forms such as the carboxylic acids at the bottom. I guess one I want to focus on probably in a couple of slides time is this PFHXA, so perfluorohexanoic acid, because it's likely this one will be more of a concern in the future as that the PFOA and PFOS-based substances are phased out. So once we've kind of got over this initial, I guess the bit of the iceberg that's above the water, which is the firefighting foam, a lot of the focus is now moving into these diffuse sources of PFAS. And because, as I said, we're using these substances throughout society, they are there. You go looking for them in various environmental media, various consumer products, and you'll find them. And as a consequence, I mean, they're going to be entering the circular economy through pretty much all of the waste streams that I've kind of covered. So plastic reuse and recycling, fiber recycling and composting, and even through food waste and wastewater and biosolids. And again, this high stability to any of the processes we're putting these wastes through, so thermal, chemical, and even biochemical methods of degradation, the PFAS are just going to persist through that. So the only way really of getting these materials out of the circular economy is to screen them out. And the science is showing most of these PFAS at the moment, the only way of getting them destroyed is through things like high temperature incineration or mechanochemical destruction. So there isn't, they will persist through these circular economy chains. And I think what I was mentioning before is, as we've seen these longer chain PFASs, so that the 8 carbon and longer be phased out, they've often been replaced in society and consumer products with the shorter chain ones, so the C6s and lower. And as a result, there's a lot more interest coming through on these shorter chain PFAS, so particularly the things like PFHXA and the butane, the butanoic acid and butane sulfonate. And really, a lot of that interest is because these are much more mobile in the environment than the longer chain PFAS, so will end up in more places. And there's a lot more reporting coming through of these PFAS in a variety of sources. So this is some work out of the US EPA last year. And this was a result of finding various PFAS in pesticide products, which was traced back to the use of fluorinated HTP containers. And these are pretty standard for storing chemicals in globally. And what you can see is from the pattern of this, you're now seeing much of the PFAS profile being the shorter chain, so the hexanoic acid, the pentanoic acid, and the butanoic acid, rather than the longer chain PFAS that have been more of a concern in the last couple of years. So focusing on perfluorohexanoic acid, just as an example here for potentially one of the challenges. There's been a lot of study on the presence of PFAS in particularly food contact papers and cardboards, and a study in the US found almost half of the food contact papers contained detectable fluorine, which was likely traced back to a PFAS. And certainly know that degradation process that PFHXA is produced from a number of the PFAS types that are used in paper and cardboard applications. So these things like 6,2-FTOH, 6,2-FTS, and the DIPAPs. And as a result, there's likely an entry into the composting process and the fiber recycling streams for PFHXA when these precursors break down. And this has been seen in some studies. So the PFHXA was found in a number of Australian composts, as well as these precursors. And it was found when these composts were exposed to oxidation, levels of the PFHXA increased as these precursors broke down. And it's also widely found in wastewater. So a study of 19 Australian wastewater treatment plants found it in all of the aqueous samples that were taken, and a good proportion of the solid samples that were taken as well. And those levels actually increased between the influent to these plants and the treated recycled water that was coming out of them. And I guess one of the issues here is because of this greater mobility of PFHXA, studies are showing that it's likely to have a greater uptake into food crops and particularly the edible parts of food crops than the longer chain PFAS like PFOS and PFOA. And it was actually the only PFAS that was detected when MPI undertook a food survey in 2018. So I guess one of the concerns here for the risk assessment is actually what the toxicity of this substance is. And really some work just last month by the US EPA on understanding that toxicity. They proposed a draft health-based guidance value of 0.5 micrograms per kg body weight per day. So in comparison to some of the other PFASs that have been of regulatory interest, this is reasonably high. So at the moment, the US is considering for PFOS and PFOA down in the picogram per kg range. So this is quite a lot higher. But in saying that, I mean, that's still a level that indicates that there is some risk of that substance, and particularly if it concentrates through these waste streams and ends up into the food chain, and you're getting that cumulative exposure to it. So yeah, I've flagged a number of hazards here, and I think there are challenges as we move to this circular economy with these persistent emerging contaminants. They will end up in the food chain as a result, and I think there's a lot of work to be undertaken to understand what's happening and to be able to quantify those risks. And I think some of the focus really has to be on understanding that feedstock material better, knowing what's going into these recycling or reuse chains. So understanding more the non-intentionally added substances, contaminants, and also understanding whether you can screen those out of that material. So removing products that might have high PFAS levels from these recycling chains to reduce the contamination through them. And then finally, understanding what the environmental fate of these will be, whether they will end up through into irrigation water and getting into crops, for example, or whether there is less of a risk because they're more less mobile. And I think one of the ways of doing this, and I think the Food Safety Science Research Centre has a well advanced process underway, is this emerging risks process. So really being able to understand the triggers for some of these contaminants coming through, so knowing this change in process to get to the circular economy, it will be essential in being able to pick up when some of these contaminants emerge. And I guess one of the other areas is whilst we've got this admirable goal of moving to a circular economy where nothing gets put into waste, I think the PFAS and some of the other intractable contaminants show that there's a need still to have a treatment process and an ability to remove these substances out and destroy them, because otherwise they will continue to circulate in these waste streams and get back into consumer goods. So just cover a vast number of references available on this. So I've just really scratched the surface, but there's a lot of science being undertaken on understanding this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That's great. We have time for a couple of questions while we're just getting Anu set up, but if you've got some, you can put them into chat. Would anyone want to raise them? You can speak as well. I mean, you covered quite a few chemicals, I guess, is my take on the presentation, Andrew. Is there one that's particularly standing out as a big concern for you?
I mean, I'm looking at that kind of list. I think a lot are still at the stage where we were trying to understand, go from the hazard to the risk assessment, also much more understanding whether they will end up in the food chain. But certainly, I mean, we've seen the perfluorinated substances come through, and I think they will continue to emerge as an issue as we understand better their use through society and cycling through these chains.
Yeah. I guess the key is, as you pointed out, the data. But I do have another question. What are the adverse health effects used for the risk assessment? That's from Rob Blake. That's a difficult one, and maybe you can.
Yeah. So a lot of the screening level for the moment for understanding the hazard has been using, say, the European Chemical Safety PBT type approach. So whether it meets screening criteria for persistence, bioaccumulation, toxicity, and they are screening criteria, so they don't necessarily relate to what the actual risk is. So I think, I mean, it's understanding. You've got a vast range of potential substances here, and then a lot of the emerging contaminants, they don't have that toxicity data behind them to do the risk assessments. So I don't think there's one size fits all really in doing these risk assessments.
Okay, I've just had one other question, and then we'll hand over to Anu. So Matthew wants to know, when we're talking about recycled plastic products that will go into recycled plastic food packaging products, has analysis been done on the finished products to see what level of unintentional ingredients are still present?
So I'm not sure I can speak to the actual products. So the actual recycled plastics. I'm not sure there's been research to understand whether there are contaminants migrating out of this. I do know I believe it was 2016, MPI did some work in New Zealand to look at migration for foods that were likely to be stored in these recycled products, and did see a couple of additives come through, so things like phthalates and some of the printing inks. Yeah,
the centre's doing some work on this too with Phil Bremer and co. So I guess it's going to be continuing work. Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and we will come back to Andrew